good afternoon, everybody. So after the high moment we had here with a photo all together, now we're gonna try to keep with a high level of the sessions. And now we are gonna have a session that I think it's very, very interesting, no? Because when you look at numbers, like just in 2019, 59% of the directors that were appointed to boards in the S&P 500 companies were basically or female or men that they are part of racial minorities and ethnic minorities, which I think it's interesting for two facts, right? Because it shows that things have been changing from orders of magnitude from periods before, and also because corporations feel that, well, there is an increase in performance and it has a good effect in performance. And we're going to talk about corporate culture here now, which I think is also very interesting because we have many questions to be answered in this topic. First, what is corporate culture? Like Bob Gibbons was saying, but many other questions that it shows that we need, right? There is a long way to go in answering them. And today we have a very interesting one, and Jillian Grennan, who's an associate professor at Santa Clara University and visiting professor at UC Berkeley, is going to present her research on basically on the topic of looking at culture diversity, how board diversity affects the culture at the different levels of the corporation, which I think it's very interesting because actually we've been studying, or we hear stories about performance of the company as a whole and so, but not that much about what happens inside the company. Then Mireia Giné is going to be the discussant of the paper, and we can wait to hear what Jillian is going to say about diverse directors' influence on DEI outcomes. So thank you very much. The floor is yours, Jillian.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me and having me out here. I have been very interested in culture for a long time. It was a paper that I ended up writing as my job market paper, was to try and understand how governance affects culture, because I didn't have this belief that really formal rule systems were really always that good for culture and they might crowd out informal rule systems. And this is actually one of the first times I've come back to write another, what I think of as corporate governance paper in this space, linking it to culture. And so this is joint work with Wei Kai at Columbia, IESE Center and Joe Pacelli, some of your colleagues at Harvard Business School, and with Lynn Key, who's recently moved to Purdue. So the major focus has been on gender balance and racial balance on boards. We have NASDAQ making new rules. We have 11 states in the US that have been considering either quotas or mandates of some type of disclosure. In Europe, it's been a long time. Norway was 2003 was the first time we had quotas. And so it's been remarkable progress if you look back. For the first time, the percentage of women in the largest 1,000 companies on the Russell 3000 is 30%. It's actually not even that much worse if we consider bigger groups. It's up to 28% for women. Women of color are 6%. I didn't have the exact number on racial minorities, but I think it's around 12%. But there's also opportunity. This is the number I love. I couldn't believe how many directors there still are that were appointed in the prior century. Okay, 1,361 directors joined their boards pre-2000, and only 8% are women. Okay, with 40% of those directors over 80 years old, that means we have a lot of new opportunities to open up space and chance to increase diversity in the US. So we seek in this paper to expand upon traditional research. And I think part of the problem is the research has been stuck on this question of profitability. If we put a more diverse board, will it become more profitable? Okay, the evidence is really mixed. The early papers came out and said, look, you're actually losing value. Okay, that's looking at one-day stock market returns, however you want to adjust it. So people went even deeper and they said, okay, let's look at cash flows, or let's look at the discount rate. It must be something about the riskiness of the firm. Okay, we've looked at it and we've looked at it, and I think the best read on it is there's winners and losers. You can sort of predict what's going to happen. It's not necessarily a supply problem. Some of the early evidence thought there was just not a big enough pool of female directors that were experienced and skilled. More recently, it's come to say, look, they are actually skilled. They're actually skilled at different things. They're skilled at ESG or sustainability or advisory more so than the old monitoring skills and financial expertise. And then finally, it's been looking at volatility. And I would say that's the only one where I think I've consistently seen evidence that boards seem to reduce the second moment of volatility in equity prices. Our motivation was to say, maybe let's move this discussion away from that and try and look at what's going on in the firm. And we think that's probably a really valuable thing to look at and understand talent composition, to understand culture, because there's millions of employees that work every day to coordinate, to produce goods and services. And in fact, there's more goods and services produced inside the firm than there is in the open market exchange. So thinking about that coordination problem, it's a big deal. It's an important one to explore. I also want to put this up here. This is something that came out of our survey. I can talk about this a little bit more today, although it's not my focus. This paper, we surveyed 1,348 executives from North American firms, and we asked them, and this was actually one that the referee made us externally validate as well. So this question has been asked twice, and we were trying to rank relative importance as long-term value drivers. So it is a long-term, not a myopic short-term equity prices. And culture came out number one here. Culture and strategy was number two. So clearly we're here talking about the most important things. You can see down there, operations, CEO did come up very important, marketing, production processes, but it's a driver of long-term firm value. And yet we don't have much focus on culture and the empirical work. And more importantly than that, some of Alex's early works talking about equity markets, they don't fully value intangibles. Okay, so we might think that maybe that was the problem in this early literature looking at equity prices. If you don't fully value intangibles, you're not going to understand and react properly when a diverse board is appointed. So what we do, we focus on depth and breadth related to diversity initiatives. And how can you think about this? What is depth? We're asking if there's trickle down. That is, if we appoint leaders at the top, does it go down to the next level, the first tier leadership? Does it go down to the middle management and to the rank and file employees? We also ask breadth. And that's saying, well, you're talking about diversity, but is it words or are there actions behind what you're doing? And so what are the day-to-day norms? What is going on inside the firm? How are you learning from experience? And I didn't put this slide up, but I thought it was remarkable, especially for the some finance people in the audience, is that they did a survey of the American Finance Association of its members. And they found I was not surprised by many of the findings, but one I was startled by, which was 60% of people did not think that their superiors adequately dealt with discrimination and bias, despite how many people said there was discrimination and bias in the profession. Okay, so I do firmly believe that it starts at the top. There is a tone at the top that teaches you the culture and teaches you what is right. And so that's sort of why we're trying to look at these breadth of outcomes and what we see happening in terms of what we're going to call community building norms. Okay, we develop our hypotheses here and to ask and think about the channels through which culture is going to be affected or through which diversity may have an influence. One is allyship, another is homophily, and the last one is sort of a broad-based cognitive diversity, and I'll go into those in more detail. We bring novel data on employee representation and culture to measure DEI outcomes. We also bring a sort of new identification strategy to this board literature. That's a strategy that looks at fuzzy regression discontinuity design. For those in the audience, it's actually really nice because it doesn't have these sort of stringent statistical assumptions. Really, as long as there's a continuous variable and you can't control the threshold, it's probably pretty internally valid. And so what's nice is also you can look at pictures and see the evidence of what's moving up and what's moving down. And then in the end, we're going to sort of evaluate trade-offs and think about next steps and think about, tokenism, check the box changes, and committee assignments. So to not lose everybody's attention in the first slides, I do like to give a preview of the main findings. So our depth is that we do find that board diversity links to gains in representation at all levels of the organization for underrepresented groups. We also find breadth. That is, diversity-related outcomes beyond those formal quotas that may be established end up becoming part of the firm, and that is they have a more inclusive culture, and employees' perception of management improves. we find that check the box actually fails. So there's been a big debate about the aggregate confusion in the ESG ratings. The within firm diversity gains are not consistently reported in any of the ESG ratings or the S ratings. Okay, and then what I would say, sort of no pay gains, one of the questions that we had in it, and we're probably going to move it to the appendix, was we wanted to see if there was actually improvement on the pay gap. And so there's a wide pay gap for both women and minorities within firms. We actually do not see any gains, and I could get it to go either side, so it's not a really tight zero either. So with that, I'll say that there's room for improvement. Maybe that's an area to look to improve. Okay, so thinking through our hypotheses. I put this up here to sort of help you think the way we thought about it, and we had a lot of internal debates. So diversity can mean many different things. And so at the top, we think about diversity related to underrepresented groups, so gender and ethnicity. But there's also other sources of diversity on boards. Age, we have a bunch of 80-year-olds, a couple 40-year-olds. Education, did you go to an elite school or not? What about board appointments? How many other boards do you sit on so you have that experience and knowledge? And then the last is sort of financial expertise. There's a lot of, being a founder or working in finance gives you ability to sit on certain committees, okay? And what I want to show you in this picture is actually our heat map of the different boards in the US over time. And so one thing that sort of always stands out to me is if you move to the second column, so the one where it says gender and you go up, it's sort of red, 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 and then white. And what the red is telling you is there's a negative correlation. That is, when you appoint a female to the board, you're losing out on ethnicity. So there's a trade-off there. You're losing out on age, education, and other categories. And so not all components can you gain on at once. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we sort of go through and look at our results. So this is the first channel we think it's going to work through, that board diversity might matter within the firm. And that's a new way of thinking, or what we call broad-based diversity. It's where, you can question the status quo. Now there's enough people with different backgrounds who somebody might be willing to come forward and ask a question or gather different information, where really this cognitive diversity leads to a new way of thinking about strategies or implementation of proposals within the firm. Okay, so the empirical test here, though, is this broad-based index of diversity should then lead to within group improvements in terms of representation of the workforce for gender and racial minorities. The opposite is when we think about homophily, and homophily is this hypothesis that because you are like me, because you are familiar, I feel towards you in a particular way, and therefore I'm going to appoint you to the first-tier leadership. If I'm a female on the board, I will appoint you to first-tier females, and it will then have a trickle-down effect that way. Okay, so the association here would be with either gender and then gender directly, or it's with ethnicity and ethnicity directly. Okay. The last one is sort of grouping it together and thinking of it as allyship. And allyship is increasing underrepresented group board members' propensity to hire other underrepresented groups. This is that we are all fighting the same fight. There has been a sense of bias. There has been a sense where you want to help out those who you are allied with. Okay, and so this is where you would expect to find some association between the groups in general, and in particular, if you really want to tease out it, and the way we do look at it in the data is to say, are women helping underrepresented minorities gain in terms of workforce representation? Okay, so what are DEI outcomes and what are we thinking of? So we have to get job flow data because we want to measure these trickle-down effects. And I bring it up as board diversity trickle-down effects really require this top-tier executives to advocate for more diversity among middle management, who then are going to be the ones advocating for those below them. And an interesting anecdote, because it came up earlier and somebody was making me think about it, when we did our survey results, we actually asked about CEO compensation, and we didn't get a lot on the affecting culture. You know which one always stood out to me in the heterogeneity? Middle management. Incentivizing middle management has a big effect on corporate culture. Okay, so remember that in what you're thinking about. And I know that I've seen ways, and we also talked about employment contracts. In my interviews with many people, one of the ones I always loved was a firm who said, we are going to promote within. and they rewarded you in the contract for the number of people you got promoted to the level that you were at. And I think that is a good way to build up culture within a firm. So this is thinking about trickle down. And then I put up, well, it's American sports, the Rooney Rule. And American football has been around since 1997. The Steelers head coach decided that every time that you interviewed for a new head coach, you had to interview at least one African American, because most of the players in football in America are African American, and all the head coaches are white. Okay? And you can sort of see what happened. It was 5%. Right after that, they made improvement. They hired 2. By the time you got to the early 2000s, it was up to 20%. Everybody was like, eventually it's going to be 50%. And then it's fallen back down, and it's actually getting worse. Okay? And why is that? And so people had to look at it, and it was actually because of the level below. All 50% of head coaches are pulled from NFL coordinators. 10% of offensive coordinators, or that level below, are actually African Americans. So you're sort of plucking the cherries and then not leaving anybody else to keep it moving beyond that. And so this is why in our data we wanted to pool employment at multiple levels, and we're doing this through LinkedIn data that's been benchmarked then to other disclosures if you are doing disclosures through the new human capital rules and other things like that. Moving beyond diversity, I'll admit I pulled this from Equileap, which is a very good source for gender-related data if you're looking for it on firms. And they said the 5 pillars of gender equity are women in leadership, access to benefits, culture, supply chain diversity, and pay equity. What we really want are these deeper proxies, and the deeper proxy we're going to go after is culture. In general, I tend to believe if you have a strong culture, it's going to permeate to many other decisions because it guides you when you don't have a contract in place to tell you what to do. Okay? And so we think for that reason, culture is probably going to be our best measure. So what is corporate culture? I'm going to do it. I'm going to do what everybody else did. I'm going to give you my feeling on it. So it's whose perspective? I think the content of culture matters a lot. Different people have different assumptions and biases. They all bring it into the table, okay? The content of culture, especially the values that they care about and the actions they take, are all over the map. And so you have to think about, how do you get these people with many different ideas all aligned on the same thing? That's what, to me, culture is. And I think it comes from what Bob was saying earlier. It comes from narratives. It comes from learning. It's not the janitor, though, telling me a story. That's not what I'm learning. I'm learning from leaders telling me how I should interpret our mistakes as a firm, or how I should think about, I've heard this saying a lot about boards, going from campfires to wildfires. You know there's a problem. You just sort of kick it down the road. But then if you kick it down the road, then it's a wildfire. That's not what you want to do. You want to learn from those simple campfires, okay? This came from our study, our survey. We asked leaders, what is corporate culture? We've got a variety of stuff, and I think this resonates well. It's a belief system, a coordination mechanism, an invisible hand, how employees interact with one another, a standard behavior, norms around how people treat people. It's part work ethic, part ambiance of the work environment, how the company really works, and the tone for what this company is. They also highlight how it works, saying it's foundational, it helps us to execute, and it also helps us to dramatically reduce agency costs. And if I think about, how is it going to play out in this firm value sense that you're not getting, it is some of these agency costs. It's guiding employees' actions when they don't have the contract, that they make those decisions that are reducing risk or helping on the upside. Okay? So my way of thinking about it from an academic definition, I'm going to go with it in the sense that I am a very empirical person. I like to think about cause and effect. Where is one line going to affect the next line? So to me, culture is an informal institution. You got to separate it out from those formal institutions. It is not governance. It is not something else. It is a pattern of behavior, sure, but it's reinforced, which means it's taught or learned by people, systems, and events, okay? Is manifest in many elements. That means it doesn't have to be just one thing, but it brings unity to employees' perspective, and that's the key to me. It's the unity through the expectations they have for how they need to behave to fit in and succeed, okay? What people? That's your leaders, your teammates, your customers, your investors. What systems? That's your markets, regulation, corporate governance. What events? This is Me Too, this is M&A deals, okay? And this is sort of how we think about it there. I'm not going to go into some of the details in the paper. We sort of put it that way. But you have, for the key for me, is that it's an interdependent process. If we're moving governance, you have to know that it's going to intermix with your culture. If you're going to try and change your culture, I actually have a piece that we recently wrote on culture and strategy, which asks what I think is an interesting question, which is, what is the half-life of investments in culture? Should I be doing this one-time big change in culture, or should it be a continuous investment process because it's about getting momentum behind the process of change? And if you think that you want to get it moving in one direction or another, it might be a continuous investment, that those continuous investments have a longer, less costly duration than the one-time big events that decay quicker. Okay, so where do we measure it though for our paper? We measure it from career intelligence websites. So this is stuff like Glassdoor. This has been a long, ongoing project in my life. I have done Glassdoor, I have done Volt, I've done Career Bliss, I've done Indeed, looking at them. The first way I used to do it was what is commonly known in computational linguistics as cosine similarities. That is, you take a set of words and you see how similar they are, and that has a nice interpretation. Except for, you know which one it's really horrible at measuring? And it's the one I actually care about, which is what I call community orientation. It's not good at getting sustainability or getting employees feeling empowered, because all of those, if you're a like actual NLP person, it's the adjective that they use to describe, and you have to really know the context. You have to know what noun they're modifying. And those are a harder computational linguistics problem. And so what we did was we had RAs go through and hand code 5,000 different Glassdoor reviews. That means you have a training data set. And from that, we taught it 40 different cultural norms. And what we then did was sort of a horse race between a variety of machine learning methods. I've tried 15 different machine learning methods. I can tell you actually, interestingly, sort of my intuition that community is very different than adaptability, you find that they're different. Okay, so we got community building norms, and these 8 norms really came from reading the reviews ourselves to see what employees are talking about. So it's being inclusive and embracing of diversity. It's thinking that you really have great management or great leadership. It's supporting personal growth. It's supporting career advancement. It's career longevity versus high turnover. It is work-life balance. It's a fun work environment, which can typically mean perks and free food, admittedly, and cares about sustainability. Okay, so what's the research design? So we're going to use this fuzzy research regression discontinuity design. And I know it's an audience of practitioners, but it's really actually a simple way of thinking about things, is you have something that you can't control. Okay, nobody can control the fact that US elections, you win at 50%. Okay, but what's really nice is that now you have a counterfactual. You know, if you were observing on the winning side versus the losing side, you just keep following them over time. Do they look the same as the winning side? Okay, so what we're doing is we're actually using the fact that local politicians, when they get appointed, if they're a diverse politician, we actually subsequently see in the 2 years afterwards that more diverse board members end up getting appointed in that same local jurisdiction. Okay, we assume the firms cannot control the election outcome. This is something you can sort of test and look at in the variables out there. And so this gives us a nice sense of the counterfactual of what is a firm who lives in a local jurisdiction that doesn't have a diverse candidate appointed versus one that lives in a jurisdiction that does. Okay, and so that's Maxine Waters. That's the guy in North Carolina. I don't live in North Carolina anymore, so it's okay. All right. This is our evidence of a discontinuity in the board diversity post the local US election. And this is why I say these ones are really nice. You can see this visual evidence. There's basically about a 5 to 7 percentage point jump in board diversity close to this threshold, and it seems to stay constant. So that lets us be happy that we have a valid research design, and we also have regression support for it. The stars typically mean statistical significance, and what this is telling us, for those who are more academic oriented in the audience, we're looking at different bandwidths, we're looking at different setups, but really in the 2 years after the diverse political candidate gets elected, you see increases in board diversity. This is great because this now tells us that we can use it in a design to understand plausibly exogenous, close to random. What happened if we randomly sprinkled board diversity on and we saw what happened afterwards? Which is really the question that we care about. This is one evidence of covariate balance, because you might be like, oh, there's all these other problems that are happening at the same time. We don't see it. If you look at a bunch of corporate characteristics, and I have even more in the paper, or firm characteristics, there's balance near the threshold. So it makes us think that this change in board diversity is truly related to the diverse local political leadership. And so our first question is about what happens to the workforce, okay? And so we're using our broad-based diversity measure here, and we see all underrepresented groups increase, and this is statistically significant. It's statistically significant if we put in pre-controls and fixed effects. It continues to be significant. There's a little bit of debate in the literature whether you need to do that, but what this is really consistent with is enlightened thought. When you have a diverse board, it leads to new ways of thinking, and new ways of thinking help you hire more employees from more underrepresented groups, okay? Then we look at the next level. Is it only in the manager level, or is it maybe just I'm hiring people? And we have flow data, so I have looked in a little bit of detail if it's basically people being promoted or if it's higher retention. And it's a little bit of a mix of both, and so we're seeing more managers. We're also seeing more at sort of the rank and file staff level, okay? The point estimates are all significant at the 5% level, and if you were to translate some of these standard deviations into percentages, you're looking at about a 2 percentage point gain in workforce diversity. The next one is to ask about culture. And Glassdoor has a star rating system from 1 to 5. You can even do a half rating if you wanted to. So at first, we're starting out with just the Glassdoor culture rating. Okay, for their culture rating, we see an improvement in culture. Okay. They also have a question where they ask about your perceptions of senior management and leadership, and I think that this is an important one because I think that they're the tone from the top. They're the ones who are teaching you the culture. Okay, and so we see improvements in management's perceived quality. Okay, and then the final one is on community building norms, and these are the sort of 8 different norms that we then aggregate together for a firm level year. And what we're seeing is improvements in these community building norms. And so that means that the employees feel included, they feel like they belong, okay? And so this is consistent with board diversity impacting the breadth of diversity related outcomes. Now this is where we get into the ESG metrics, and I teach sustainable investments, and I love to get these people to come into my class and talk to me about the new technology to measure sustainability. Okay, so we have Sustainalytics, Refinitiv, KLD. I haven't tried it with MSCI, but I do have access to it now. So Refinitiv, it is positively correlated here. It is also positively correlated for Refinitiv's broad social metric, which is the second one, as indicated by the star. That's a 10% significance. I am less convinced, though, of it in the paper because we look at it in different experimental designs in different settings, and then in other settings you'll see them be different. But the fact that you have a negative coefficient here, a very positive one, and a slightly positive one, just once again adds to the idea that you can't have a check-the-box approach to thinking about diversity and thinking about ESG, that these discrepancies suggest we should look further, and especially those who might be in asset management, and I've spent some time talking to people about their gender and racial lens strategies. You need to move beyond, or as a regulator, you need to work harder on harmonizing standards. So with that, we also did additional tests, okay? Yes, fuzzy regression discontinuity is great. I like it, I get excited about it. It's the best internally valid one. That means there's consistent estimates and we can have confidence in our inferences, but it may not generalize beyond those firms that are sort of close to this threshold, okay? And so then we look at it in different ways. We look at the state law changes surrounding gender balance on boards, and then another one where we look at IV, or an instrumental variable method based on shifts in the supply of directors. I think the pro of the state law change is that we can actually then look at gender specifically, because it's all about gender, and understand if it's homophily or an allyship channel. The cons are, mandates may be pushing firms who are already at their optimum to a suboptimal level. Okay, and that's what all this debate that looked at the Norway quotas and all of the pricing literature on equity prices has had a problem with, is saying that no, the reason that the price goes down is actually because you have a suboptimal board. Okay, this says, well, in the first case, it was endogenous that they were choosing their board, so I didn't have to deal with that argument. And the last one is looking at shifts in supplies of directors, and we're building on the work about direct flights. Although somebody just told me today that the offices rotate offices, which I was like, oh, that sort of works against us, so I'll have to revisit that idea. But we are saying, is there a direct flight from your home to the headquarters of this company? If there is, and tend to think that the airlines changing their flights is exogenous, then that's how we're getting randomization or shift in sort of the supply of directors available. Okay, so for the state law changes, I just want to let you see. So these are the 6 states in the US that are treated states. Some of them it's state of incorporation, or others it's are you headquartered there. Okay, what we do is we're looking at, and this is just the percentage increase in females on the board in 2 years after the law change. And then the other is the other control groups. So yes, females have been trending over time. What you're really seeing in this one is that the second column is much higher in this first category of treated firms. Okay. And this shows you that yes, there's the trend over time, but again, if we're even doing it in a dynamic setting, we're seeing an increased jump up after these law changes occur. Okay. So this then allows us to look and analyze the homophily and allyship channel. And we actually find evidence for both. I think the homophily channel is stronger, okay? But what it's telling you is that when you appoint more females, they're gonna appoint that first tier more females. That will have trickle-down effects, and we can see it throughout who's getting hired. And the same thing with allyship. We do not see it for non-white managers, which makes me think that it actually might happen through then more of a formal quota if you're on the board as a female. And how is this allyship working? It's that you want to improve overall representation of underrepresented groups. And so it is not necessarily that you're picking that person to be in the senior leadership level that looks like you, okay? And so I was telling you a little bit about the airline ones, what's going on there. Well, the common worry was that they're too local. So the solution builds on that, you know, it's a different setting, a different set of complier firms, and what can we learn from this different set of complier firms? And we basically find identical results, which for me, as an empiricist, it's rare to find things consistently. I was looking, I was like, what boxes are gonna consistently get checked here? And I was really excited to see that basically the culture results go through, the workforce results go through, and here we got even more mixed results in terms of the ESG metrics and the pay. So in conclusion, you know, board diversity is associated with depth and breadth of diversity-related outcomes. We see a more diverse workforce. Employees perceive improvements in the culture, and especially community-building norms, and we approve more of senior management. Cognitive diversity, homophily, and allyship all represent important channels through which board diversity works. And as boards continue to turn over, as we get these older people who are plus 80 and ready for retirement, we have a chance for even more improvements. For example, pay gaps could improve. Thank you, guys.
Mireia is going to do the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss Jillian's paper. It's always a pleasure because I know very well Jillian's work, and it's always this combination of a lot of food for thought with rigorous methodological approach. So in this paper, the authors address a very big question. What is the impact of board diversity on different measures of corporate culture? And the first thing that I would like to highlight is I was very pleased to see, okay, finally a paper coming from finance, finally a paper that does not address the direct link with performance. So this is away from performance, away from firm value. And I think that very much the initial literature was very much obsessed about finding a direct link between board diversity and performance, because then we thought, okay, then we are settled, right? We are settled. We can either find a very strong relationship, and in fact, if we fast forward, what we have, if we take a look into the literature so far, and Edmund's has done a very good overview, is that if we look at very rigorous peer-reviewed journals that take into consideration causality, the relationship is not very strong. So away from profitability, but into a very important intangible, which is culture. And this question has two challenges from the outset. And the first challenge is to come up with a very useful definition of diversity. And they have to think about a definition of diversity that goes hand in hand with the mechanism that they think this diversity will operate. So it's not obvious how to build a good proxy for diversity. And the second challenge is to come up with causal estimations. And this is not academic snobbery. This is really trying to come up, trying to identify the levers that can really then facilitate changes in corporate policies, right? And in fact, the lack of causality in the initial literature of board diversity and performance has generated a lot of havoc, of problems. So this paper has three ingredients that are very interesting. First of all, granular and new data about trying to pin down what is culture. And they look into employment at managers and staff. They look into pay practices. They look into different norms and culture perceptions and ESG ratings. So a lot of outcome variables. They use a plethora of methodologies to tease out causal effects. And then they talk about three different causal mechanisms. The first one, cognitive diversity, which spans across these 6 different dimensions. They talk about homophily, which is this identification, this closeness between individuals, and allyship, which refers to a solidarity channel. So let me do an overview of the results. The paper has a lot of results, and I decided to group them by outcomes. So the paper states that board diversity does change the composition of the organization. In fact, as you have more board diversity, you're going to have more underrepresented groups, more females and non-whites, both at the managers and staff level. And this is going to work through the 3 channels, through the channel of cognitive diversity, through the channel of homophily, and through the channel of allyship/solidarity. And on the right-hand side, you see all the different methodologies that the paper uses to come up with these results. The second set of results pertains to the impact of board diversity on pay gap. And in fact, overall, across these different channels, there is no impact. We'll talk more, what does this mean, that there is no impact? And then thirdly, the paper highlights the impact of board diversity on improvement on culture ratings, perception of best places to work, and weak improvements on ESG ratings. And here, the 2 channels are weakly the cognitive channel and the gender ethnicity index. Okay, so my comment, I would like to start with this graph, which I found fascinating. First of all, to learn that cognitive diversity panned out through these different 6 dimensions. And secondly, to see that gender negatively correlates with nearly everything. So it correlates negatively ethnicity, with age, with education, and with expertise. But then ethnicity is very different in nature. As you can see, right, ethnicity is going to have very different heat map. It's either white or a little bit blue. So that both, if we use gender and ethnicity, we are really capturing very distinct dimensions of diversity. But importantly as well, then when you look into age, education, and expertise, the correlation between these variables as well is very low, meaning that if we have these 6 dimensions, then we are actually capturing something extremely broad, and each dimension will capture something unique. So this is really useful. And this brings me to the first comment, which is why explore 3 different mechanisms, okay? What do we learn beyond cognitive diversity? And how easy is to disentangle this cognitive diversity that has these 6 distinct dimensions versus homophily and allyship? Are we talking here about distinct mechanisms, or are we talking here about a sort of nested mechanism? So could cognitive diversity lead to the same outcomes that in fact we are observing by looking at homophily and allyship? And thinking more about the mechanisms, the paper as it stands has a lot of content. So we have these 3 mechanisms, we have 4 econometric methods, and we have at least 4 outcomes. And I was thinking, well, maybe if we focus on what is the strength of each methodology, we can actually gain more insight into the different mechanisms. So the first comment would say, to Jillian would say, why do we need the panel results for, in this particular paper that doesn't give us any insight into causality? And I very much like the regression discontinuity approach. I've worked on this methodology, and I think that it really works very well for the broad cognitive specification. But maybe I'm a little bit less convinced about how it pans out for gender and ethnicity. Although, as you have seen, that this regression discontinuity depends on women and ethnic candidates really winning at the margin of the election, and that is what brings participation further at the board. So the RD, I think it's a very useful approach. But most importantly, state legislation changes that you have seen bring women into the board, and I think that it's a very natural method to study homophily and allyship. So maybe use the mechanisms to choose among the methods. I think it will strengthen the paper. The third comment is the importance of this top-down versus bottom-up. And as I was preparing for this discussion, I was reading one of the main media outlets that probably we all share, and the title was that for radical transformation in gender issues, we needed a bottom-up approach. And I was thinking, oh my gosh. Okay, so there is very much that literature that bottom-up is really the way to go, whereas when we look into the data, we really see that the top-down effect is really potent. So I would like to ask the authors, what is how significant are the results to start with that you are estimating? How transformative of the organization? And then how does it trickle down? So far, the paper looks at managers and staff. Is there a chance for us to understand a little bit better the trickle-down effect? Especially, we know that it's really hard for women to break into the executive committee, into the executive team. Does this have really an important transformational effect to the organization? And as well, to talk about the promotion gap, right? So if we think about the promotion gap or promotions as selecting candidates based on skills, well, now we have other mechanisms that the authors are suggesting us to think of: homophily, closeness, or allyship, solidarity. But here, to be a little bit provocative, should we consider homophily and allyship as bias? My fourth comment, well, all these changes, especially, for example, the changes in the state law, they're going to land in boards with different structures. And we know that there's as well a hierarchy within boards. So we understand the weight of the chairman, especially if it's distinct of the CEO. And as well, what are the roles of the different committees? So if we want changes in promotion, we have to pay attention what's going on, what's cooking in the nomination committee. And we want to see what's happening in the pay practices. We need to understand what's going on in the remuneration committee. Why is that? Because we all know that chairmen of these committees that have to bring to the board what actually is happening at their committees and have to really deliver to the rest of the board. So I think there's a lot going on these spheres. And as well, I wanted to ask the authors about the concern of tokenism. So if we pass state laws, but corporations only appoint one woman, is this enough to observe transformation or not? And my final comment on something that I really appreciate as well from the paper is showing with data that ESG is not a checklist approach type of solution. The paper shows that different providers will record changes, ESG changes in different ways. And in fact, the results are either not present or weak using the supply of directors. So sort of pointing to a little bit the tyranny of the ESG checkbox approach and the invitation for corporations to actually do the right thing for their own corporations to enhance their cultures beyond the ESG ratings. So in sum, the paper asks really a first-order question. It forces us to think about board diversity away from short-term direct firm value, but through a more long-term mechanism, which is through culture. And I think that the paper brings three very powerful ideas. First of all, that board diversity does change the firm's composition of the employees and the culture and the norms. Secondly, that the importance of the top-down mechanism. And third, that there are channels such as homophily and allyship that are important just beyond cognitive diversity. Thank you.
Thank you. Jillian, do you want to make any comment before we open the floor to questions?
Well, I wanted to thank you. It was a very thoughtful discussion and super helpful. So this was an early version of the paper, so I'm very open to comments and thoughts about that. The tokenism and the highest level of female leadership are on my to-do list. I've looked at committees. Actually, they tend to get appointed to governance committees. I don't know why. I couldn't explain that, so I sort of just put it to the side. But we're hoping to build out and do more research on this. But in general, I have also done a lot of work on corporate culture. So any other questions you have about it, I like to talk about culture.
Any questions? Yes.
Okay, thank you. Very good afternoon for you. Thank you very much to Jillian for this amazing presentation, and as well for Mireia for this understanding explanation to be able to understand deeply your paper. Indeed, it's a very important topic because talking on diverse measures of the board members is very important and crucial topic to deal with the innovation in the in companies. And for me is only to say thank you for bringing this topic to here, and congratulations. Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
I agree, these are really interesting results. I didn't fully understand the first identification. I understand you've got lots of strategies, so you're not hanging your hat on just one of them, but let me understand. So the regression discontinuity, I completely understand that's exogenous, that has a causal effect on board diversity, and then you show that it affects diversity within the firm. But isn't the exclusion restriction that the local politician has to affect the hiring within the firm only through the board diversity channel? So could there be a direct effect, sort of, even if board diversity did not change, that there's a direct causality between, okay, local politicians is affected. If I'm an internal person within the organization, even if my board hasn't changed, I need to recognize that I need to be much more inclusive. So it's still an interesting channel, but the direct effect is the politician, not the actual board member changing.
Right. So an RDD design, you want to show the covariate balance, it gets transformed into an IV. The IV needs to pass the exclusion restriction. We're going to argue for it passing the exclusion restriction because you can't sort of manipulate the threshold. We've tried placebo checks with other thresholds. I would say I didn't show these results. We did social movement in the back. And so we looked at, I actually pulled all the deaths and the Twitter data from when Black Lives Matter happened and looking at that, because that sort of gives you a staggered diff and diff. And we don't see any evidence that it's really coming from social movements. I think it really is this discontinuous change in the appointment. But yes, it could potentially happen through other channels, and I guess we would have to do more to rule out and put in additional controls, which we do put in a lot of pre-controls in different settings for various governance characteristics or things that you might think are potentially political spending or something like that.
I think the issue is not causality, it's fully exogenous. I fully agree it's causal, there's no issue there, but I think, is there direct causality from the politician to what's happening within the firm? So that's the sort of, it's still a causal channel, but it doesn't need to go through the directors, which is interesting because you had the result. Let's say there were some directors which have been there for ages and they're not changing, unlike what you found out. I would still be optimistic because all I require is a politician to change. Even if the board was completely stuck, you might still see some movement within the organization.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this great presentation. I have a very basic question, a little bit double-sided. One is, could you share with us the effects of the regulation in these states where regulation was passed, like, how it affected? And then the other one is that it seems that a lot of the shareholder proposals in the last 3 years have to do with gender and diversity more generally. So do you have any insights on whether these shareholder proposals have had any teeth in these changes?
Sure. So let me do the last first. The shareholder proposals. I agree. I'm shocked by this. That when I originally wrote my paper, which actually looks at shareholder proposals and then goes to culture, I had wanted to look at some of these E&S factors, and you see that it's only like 10 or 20%. We're now up to 40% on most of the E&S proposals in the U.S. But remember, in the U.S., the way the governance works is you don't have to implement a proposal. When we looked at our previous paper, it was, if it got past the passing threshold, it was almost 70% likely to get implemented. But you can think about Exxon and, you know, sort of even what's going on there. The whole reason was that they didn't have a board that seemed appropriate. So that, and then going back to the states, it mattered. So I would say in our data, and I know this because it's who did it earlier, I'm sure our complier firms are mostly Colorado and California, okay? What the like other side of the equation is, yes, I'm aware that we're like uniquely identified there, but I think more people are coming about, and this has been a long question for me, is to try and understand where the variation is coming from. And so for me to see it actually in this airplane design and to see that that matched up really made me happy, because that's actually can allow us to go into a slightly earlier period. So we're a little stuck in our data that LinkedIn and Glassdoor and things like this that we pulled the data from. You know, we're looking at basically the most recent 12 years. So it's not that we're looking back this full history, which I think the world is changing rapidly. But I understand that there's also a lot of people who would like to see us go back in time.
Thank you, that was super interesting. One question, I'm looking specifically at activist investors. So most of the activist investors call for a change on the board, i.e. engine number one, i.e. there's a couple of big cases going on right now in the United States. Did you look at how an activist investor might be involved in causing some of this change or in the nomination of these board members? Or is that something that didn't come out in the data?
I mean, so this is a very new phenomenon, and I will admit that I have other previous work that looks at hedge fund activism that shows that they're basically detrimental to firm value through a culture channel. In my general view, if we think about it, and I tried to develop a mechanism, which I'll talk about that paper a little bit, is, you know, think about this. You have some very successful people, and do they spawn the next generation of successful people? No, but we put a lot more money into these strategies. And so people are going after perhaps not as successful funds. I know you were talking about your paper earlier and seeing that. That would be my guess. The ones that I find interesting, Carl Icahn at McDonald's. Why are you going after pigs? Okay, but this is a good idea, because it's actually what I think ESG lacks is some of these sort of, you know, we know from criminal law, deterrence work. Okay, who is everybody afraid of? They are all afraid of activist hedge funds. They all hate them. Every exec I've ever talked to hates them. Okay, so that, getting somebody like that involved is going to help move forward in this revolution, if that's what it is, of ESG and trying to do some different things. And so in that regards, you know, I'd love to look a little bit of our stuff at hedge funds. We have institutional ownership as a control, but that's probably, you know, that's BlackRock. That's not necessarily the Carl Icahns of the world. But I think it's a really interesting debate to think more broadly if we can bring, you know, these feared people in as sort of a deterrent mechanism. I think it's a great idea.
Thank you.
Finally, there is a question not on the left-hand side of the room, right? Now we move to the center of the room.
Yeah, so this is a bit along the lines of Alex. So it might be good to have a story about how the change in the politician affects the company. I mean, presumably these are national corporations incorporated in Delaware. So you're looking at the headquarters. This is where you define the politics, but the Glassdoor data is national. So, you know, why should what does the change in the politician really reflect? And why, for example, don't they move their corporate headquarters if they're not happy with the change in the local culture in the state where the flip occurs?
So sorry, to be clear, ours is not, so yes, 75% of firms are in Delaware. We're looking at where they're headquartered. So they're headquartered much more different than where they are incorporated. So many firms are incorporated in Delaware, but their state of operation is going to be there. So we're looking at where their main operation is. The way I think about it is that you want to garner influence, right? And if you just saw that the new politician, and maybe I'm generalizing from thinking of local chambers of commerce and stuff in Philadelphia, but there is definitely representatives, or you could even like think of, I almost put an example in the paper with AOC in the US, but I agree. I think it's a great point that we need to maybe fully develop that a little bit more to flesh it out for people. I think it makes you more comfortable.
I mean, I think, Texas flips Democrat, okay? And then are they going to stay in Austin, Texas, but get a more diverse board? Or are they going to move to Nashville, Tennessee? I mean, that's the question.
Yeah.
Thank you. I had a question. I mean, it's so you have different dimensions in DEI, so gender, ethnicity, etc. So my question is, have you studied the substitution effects that could exist between race or gender or other characteristics about that? Or is it something you're interested in? You see what I mean? So for instance, if you have someone from a certain ethnicity, then you would have less, it could be a male or a female and of different race, and therefore you would have less other people of underrepresented groups because you have.
Sorry, so are you asking the question about intersectionality if I have a Black female? Or are you asking the question?
Substitution effects.
So I think we did a lot of descriptive or panel data as she described it in the paper, and it's probably too many of the tables right now. I think in some realm, we wanted to know these nice descriptive statistics. You learn a lot from it, but then you have the snobbery side that people like causality, and so then we move in the other direction. From it, was there anything that really surprised me? Maybe a little bit of having been a female who's done fundraising for community and charity events and all of that, and thinking through it, I did not see as much allyship on what I would call the non-white tech director who it tends to be, helping out with females in tech firms. And so that, if you're going to think of who you want to go after, that might be it.
Keeping it in a row here. So I'm curious, do you find any, you talk about tokenism, do you find any effect if there's only one woman, let's say, on the board versus if there's multiple women on the board, that there'll be a broader, deeper effect of the things that you find?
Yeah, so this is a great point, and this is something that we need to do. I think it would be a nice nice interaction term to put into the study, and we haven't done it. So I would love to see it. In general, the belief is that yes, you need more than the token female to encourage it. And I would say that the other thing that I always have found really interesting was this. I found this old study from the 90s that I might have mentioned, where women, if you ask them to describe the ideal culture of a firm or the ideal board, is very different, and these were board of directors, than what men said was the ideal culture for the firm or the ideal board dynamics. And the fact that we're, that it is Mars and Venus or whatever plays out in real life, but we have to align and be part of one firm with one expectation. To me, it is where culture comes in. And I think more even about these ESG strategies, how do I often teach them to my students? Everybody can agree on what financial returns are. Not everybody can agree on what social returns are. And if you ask asset managers versus, customers versus employees, everybody has a different view. And so how are you going to align that? And maybe actually this learning, this culture, and how we do teach culture to so many different employees can help us have a lesson for how we can teach it more broadly.
Time for a final question. I have a final question because I'm the moderator, right? So I can get some of my rights. Have you checked flat companies versus hierarchical companies? Because I had mixed feelings here of what could happen. Or different sectors too, where structures, are more.
This is where I love strategy people, because I really appreciate and think about information flows across an organization, how you might design it differently. Where is good data on flat versus hierarchical? I would love to put that in, because I've even been thinking, if people want to ask me about social media screening, is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, because it's becoming much more prevalent in the US, and it's going to actually allow you to select on culture or employee characteristics much more so than you previously could. And so you could really have a culture that is defined by people's outside interests. But I would think, in my theory, that it's going to be very different for you'd probably want to select heavily on a flat structure, or if it's top down, you might not want to select as heavily. It doesn't really matter. You can teach the culture there. I think there's a lot of interesting open questions. So I'm glad that we get to have such a mixed group of people in the audience. I think it's really wonderful.
Okay, good. I think with this final thought, we are on time. So let me thank very much Jillian and Mireia for the great job, and all of you for the great questions. Thank you.